points that Nadine has made and that Andrew made about the freedom required to do business well, that there's still a political sort of advantage in stymieing RBS a little.
Well, there's a specific question that Emma Miliband asked that David Cameron didn't answer, which is if the government, as the shareholder, majority shareholder in RBS, are asked to enable RBS to pay bonuses above 100% of salary. Now, it strikes me 100% of salary bonus or compensation, whatever term you want to use for it, but a bonus strikes me as being pretty generous, and those are the rules that came into effect from the 1st of January. But if you want to do above that, above 100%, up to 200%, then the shareholders have to approve it. The government is the shareholder, and he was asked the question, would the government approve that or not? And he didn't answer it.
Is it next year that comes in, John, those new EU rules?
The EU rules, which mean that if anyone wants to pay more than 100% of salary as a bonus, it has to go through the shareholders. That applies from next year to performance during the course of 2014. So that rule hasn't actually kicked in yet and won't kick in as far as the bonuses in the next round are concerned. The argument about whether big bonuses on that sort of scale should be allowed, that's still a live one because it's open to the government to put those sort of caps on. But the implication of what David Cameron had to say was it's up to the bank the exact size of an individual bonus. What they're going to limit is the overall pot of money out of which those bonuses and salaries will come.
But the overall pot of money, you've got to remember that just this year 2,000 people are leaving, that they're getting rid of RBS in their investment bank. That's not people who are leaving because they can get more money elsewhere. It's because they're cutting back on some of their activity. So when you talk about the overall pot in terms
efficiency, then.
No, when you're talking about the overall pot for salaries and bonuses, which is the point you're making, if that's amongst a smaller group of people, that doesn't negate potentially those bonuses continuing to rise. So there's a bit of a red herring in the way that argument was expressed.
We're going to get a speech from Ed Miliband, I think it's on Friday this week, isn't it, John, about, or where he's expected to talk about capping of bonuses.
Well, and about the share of the market, the banking market, that a particular bank can have. It's the shared policy, if you like, across parties, that there should be more competition on the high street and among banks, more players in the banking business. And Ed Miliband is now going to be telling us on Friday about his plans to make sure that happens. So force the bigger banks to sell off part of their banking empires, as it were, to make sure that there are more players.
Stephen Gilbert, where are the Lib Dems on this, particularly in the light of what Miliband said today?
Sure, I think most people listening will recognise that bonuses do serve a role in rewarding good performance, but they should not be used to reward bad performance. And at the moment we still see RBS as a struggling bank, not delivering its lending targets, not making the necessary structural reforms that put it on a stable footing. And I'd have thought that 100% of salary for most people listening would seem a very, very generous bonus to be receiving, and that's why I welcome what the Prime Minister said today about vetoing any increase in the overall pot of money that's being offered to the bankers.
Andrew Lilliker, what do we know about what people think about smaller banks? Is that what the public generally wants? Do you know?
I doubt very much people have very firm opinions in the general public. I imagine that they just like having a secure bank down at the high street that works and doesn't go bust and doesn't come to call them for money, I would have thought. But it's definitely the way things are going to increase the pressure on some of these institutions to get a bit smaller. So RBS, taking that example again, has been shrunk very markedly since 2008, quite reversing its rather grandiose international ambitions up to that point. The European Commission insisted on divestment. That means bank branches and other kinds of assets of RBS and Lloyds, following the ways that they were assisted in the financial crisis. That's reflecting the state aid given to RBS and the merger with HBOS in the case of Lloyds. So those kinds of things were already insisted, and of course we've seen some of the fruit of that in the TSB as a new bank on the high street already. And I'm quite sympathetic to the idea of having some kind of cap on the total size of banks to reflect the systemic risk which has created, the kind of gaming of the system, the pressure on politicians to bail banks out. So I think Ed Miliband might be onto a winner with that one.
And Nadine Dorries, just briefly on this, you said, and I may be misquoting you, but you said some time ago that David Cameron and George Osborne were arrogant, out-of-touch posh boys, or something like that. Is banking the area where that can most easily be tested?
No, I think there's absolutely no relation between that comment and this issue. But I would like to just pick up on something Andrew's just said. You know, the government shareholding in RBS means, in a way, that we expect RBS to be a beacon in terms of both its performance in meeting lending targets and helping small businesses in its mortgage lending. We want RBS to be a beacon for other banks to follow. It
not
should
yet,
be.
is it?
It isn't. And there is this kind of this shortfall in its operational ability and what it wants. But of course, it is a beacon. It is the bank which is speaking out and which is the first to challenge the EU ruling, which will come in next year, and to, if you like, be brave and bold to say, actually, this is what the rest of the banks are going to be doing too. It isn't just going to be RBS. The others are going to be in a similar situation. And I
So
think
they're getting in early.
Well, I don't think they're getting in early, but I think they're definitely setting the ground because the other banks will follow. But in terms of limiting bank size, it's interesting that Ed Miliband has said that what he wants to do is limit banks, I think, to 25% of market share. I'm not quite sure how that happens because the growth of a bank and the generic growth of a bank depends on its success and the products that it offers to the market and how attractive those
You think that
profits
inherently
are
limits success,
and its
do you?
performance. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how this is going to take place
Stephen
and how it's
Gilbert
going to happen.
and Tom Greatrex, just briefly on
It's
this.
very disappointing to see that RBS are a beacon for changing the rules on their remuneration and ahead of the pack on that,
Quite, I agree
but
with you.
not ahead of the pack on lending to small businesses, on lending to house buyers and others. And that's why I make the point again that I think bonuses do play a useful role for rewarding good performance, but RBS isn't in that position.
So is Ed Miliband picking the wrong fight, in your view?
No, I think there really is great public disquiet about bankers being seen to continue to reward themselves, and in RBS's case, reward themselves for underperformance.
And the key here is that the government, if they're asked, as the shareholder in RBS, to approve bonuses of above 100% up to 200%, which strike me, and Stephen made this point before, as being significant sums of money as bonus for performance, whether it's good or bad, that the government have the opportunity to say no to that. He was asked that today, David Cameron. He hasn't yet answered that. He should be.
Okay, we'll talk more in a moment about George Osborne's speech on Europe that he gave this morning. But thank you, Andrew Lillico, Fellow of the Institute of Economic Affairs. It's a free market think tank. Many thanks. Nadine Dorries is here with me today, Conservative MP for Mid-Bedfordshire, Tom Greatrex, Labour MP for Rutherglen and Hamilton West, and Stephen Gilbert, Lib Dem MP for St Austell and Newquay, with me and John Pienaar, Five Live's Chief Political Correspondent. Let's get some travel news before anything else. Here's Orna.
Thanks, Sheila. And moving well on the motorways overall, but the Gloucestershire area, a couple of problem areas. The M5 heading south, junction 13 at Stroud, one of the lanes has been closed. It's all to recover a broken down lorry. Lane 1 has been closed out of the 3 to allow the lorry to undergo a tyre change. The M50 on the westbound side, and between junction 1 at Tewkesbury and junction 2 at Ledbury, a vehicle has overturned and one lane has been closed for recovery. And then looking at the A roads, in Essex, the A126, that's in West Thurrock, and just near to the Lancaster roundabout, a lorry has overturned, but it's now blocking the road at the roundabout itself. And in London, in Shepherd's Bush, Uxbridge Road has reopened, but the police were dealing with an incident near Shepherd's Bush Underground Station. So as a result, they closed the road for a while, and it was closed from Holland Road and Shepherd's Bush Green along that stretch there between the southern roundabout. It looks as though all lanes are open again now, but it is part of the one-way system. It did cause some congestion. Warner mentioned 5 Live Travel.
Get Set Glasgow on 5 Live. Welcome then to Glasgow. This is Get Set Glasgow. 5 Live's monthly shows building up to the 2014 Commonwealth Games.
Alongside the banks of the Clyde, starting to see the venues in place already. There is a sense that a big occasion is building up.
Scotland's greatest ever sportsman, Sir Chris.
The Commonwealth Games are a very special event for me and for all the athletes, but I think for the ones who are going to have that home support, it'll be extra special indeed.
Get Set Glasgow, Thursday night
From 8 on 5 Live.
So the Chancellor George Osborne has told the EU it must reform or face decline. I bet that went down well. In a speech this morning organised by 2 Eurosceptic groups, he said Europe was in danger of losing out to countries like India and China unless it changes.
Innovation, where Europe's share of world patent applications nearly halved in the last decade. Look at unemployment, where a quarter of young people looking for work can't find it. Look at welfare. Europe accounts for just over 7% of the world's population, 25% of its economy, and 50% of global social welfare spending. We can't go on like this.
He said reform is possible and would be to everyone's benefit. He also reiterated the Conservative pledge to hold a referendum on Europe.
13 years ago, William Hague warned of the dangers of the euro, for Europe and for Britain. And he was right, and I believe he was right too, when he said that our country wanted to be in Europe, but not run by Europe. In Europe, but not run by Europe. That's the phrase that sums it all up for me. Now we have the chance to give the British people a real choice. The biggest economic risk facing Europe doesn't come from those who want reform and renegotiation. It comes from a failure to reform and renegotiate.
That was George Osborne earlier today. John, there was some speculation that a meeting between the Prime Minister and Conservative MPs here in Westminster last night, a private meeting, was almost like a preamble to this, but it turned out not to be the case. It wasn't mentioned Europe in this meeting.
It was all over very quickly from what we understand. It didn't turn out to be a general cluster surrounded by the hordes of Sioux and Apache braves and bravely fending them off. If anything, the fire went the other way, and as we understand it, he told these Tory MPs, don't write letters complaining about policy on Europe. Come
and see me.
Come and talk about it. That's against the background of that a move by 95 backbenchers to say, look, we want some sort of parliamentary veto over EU law. Some of those MPs, by the way, say they had nothing to do with that letter, even though their name appeared on it.
I think it's just one, wasn't it?
Well, Andrew Tyree said that, who also claims that others were in the same position.
Yeah, he claims, but nobody else has come forward. It was just one person who was the result of a whips operation.
And that was a counter attack from Nadine Dorries.
Nadine Dorries, Conservative MP for Mid Bedfordshire, taking the feather out of her hair. You were not at the meeting, were you?
No, I was not at the meeting last night. It was a quick 20-minute meeting with 3 questions. I think if I had been there, it might have lasted the full
hour. A bit longer.
It was just a very short meeting.
Well, on what George Osborne said on Europe, Tom Greatrix, Labour MP, is with us today for Rutherglen and Hamilton West. Is reform the only way forward for Europe?
Well, I think there are areas where there does need to be reform in Europe, and obviously people will know that if there is significant transfer of powers, there will be a referendum. That's already legislated for. That's the legislation that's already on the statute book. I mean, I think, unfortunately, I can only go by the reports of the meeting last night, but it seemed to be, it was a bit of a sense that the Conservative Party leadership was saying to people, look, stop banging on about Europe, because this isn't what people are more concerned about, and that is, that's sort of reflected, I think, in the issues, more general issues around growth, economy, and jobs. Which, whilst there are European impacts on some of those, they are fundamentally important, and that's where I would have thought any party that's seeking to get re-elected as a government should be focusing their activity. And I think that's probably what last night was about.
And is it useful to say? I know it's a fact, I suppose, that in the global race we have to compete with India and China, but the trade union history is either different or non-existent in places like India and China that we have in Europe. The whole ethic of social and welfare, which is something George Osborne touched on, it's entirely different. Is it a useful comparison in this instance?
I think there clearly is a global competitive context for the European Union, and we do need reforms to make sure that Europe remains able to be at the forefront of that. But it shouldn't be
a homogenous
the global
approach.
race shouldn't be a race to the bottom, and I think it should be very clearly seen in a way of preserving the living standards that we have in Europe, building on those, making sure that the rights for workers that we have entrenched in most European countries are protected and maintained. When we're talking about winning the global race, we shouldn't be talking about winning the global race to the bottom.
But they're costly,
standards.
aren't they? They're costly, those rights that have been hard won.
Indeed they are, but they also provide protections for millions of people, often in low-paid and difficult employment circumstances. So we mustn't see the global race as a race to the bottom and throw out all the very good things that have been built in post-war Europe to try and win that race.
And in some of those countries, the acceleration of the middle class in China and a non-democratic state in China and a sort of democratic state in India, with you'll get starting to see pressure on some of those issues. Issues around health and safety at work and things that are coming.
You think that's just an inevitable process?
Well, as a process of changing the economy and the structure of that economy, that becomes an issue for people in those economic situations.
Since I arrived in Parliament 9 years ago, we've been talking about the advancement of the BRIC countries certainly since I arrived, and this has always been the backdrop against which Europe was going to have to compete, and we've known that for some time. And we've also seen reform of some European countries. We've seen what's happened to Greece and some of the southern European countries. They have desperately been trying to reform, but it's happening very slowly and in some cases not at all. We may see another raft of austerity measures have to be brought into some of those countries. And so whereas I'm fully sympathetic with the objective of economic reform in European countries, it's not actually, I don't believe, achievable. And what we found this week was, when you were talking about the 95 signatures of the letter, that a cross-party committee, a select committee of MPs who are responsible and knowledgeable about European scrutiny have asked that Parliament has a veto over the European Union dictating laws in the UK, laws like the one we're seeing coming into effect next year. And so this has just come to a head.
The one on banking,
because of it says on banking. Yeah, this has just come to a head because of this select committee report. Now, George Osborne's speech, I think, is a backdrop to that. Yes, I agree with George. We do need to have reform, but it isn't going to happen. We do have on the statute books there will be a referendum in 2017, and that referendum will take place if there's a Conservative government, because David Cameron is committed to that. And I don't think there is a time for reform. There is only an objective to have a referendum.
Okay.
The issue that Nadine raises about scrutiny is very important. I sit on a thing called the Procedure Committee in the House of Commons, and we're doing an inquiry into this, following on from Bill Cash's committee's inquiry. And there are, the way we scrutinise European legislation in Parliament is something which I think does need to change, and that's widely recognised. That's a different issue, though, from having the inevitable and endless, it seems, in the Conservative Party, existential debate about Europe. And it just becomes, it becomes proxy for another issue. But the way in which we need to scrutinise that legislation is important. I can give you an example in the recent past of legislation that was going to be proposed from Europe around the regulation of health and safety in the offshore environment, where actually in the UK we've got much better regulation than anywhere else because of Piper Alpha and everything that flowed from that. And through the process of that scrutiny and the stance that Parliament was taking, actually the European Commission backed off from the proposals they were having. That's the way in which you do it properly to be effective on an evidence basis.
Not veto level.
I've got a lot of sympathy with the points Tom's making on the need for improved parliamentary scrutiny. What we're missing, though, sometimes in this debate is the importance to people's jobs here in the United Kingdom for our membership of the single market. 3 million jobs across the country are linked to our membership of the single market, and over the last decade about 250,000 new jobs have been created because of our relationship with our European neighbours. And there is a danger as we stumble towards 2017 with the Conservative Party continually obsessing about Europe that we lose sight of what it's delivered to Britain, which is 3 million jobs across that country.
It's not obsessing about Europe. It's about, well, let's just go on to the scrutiny point. There wouldn't be this continual debate if the democratic process took place. A select committee of cross-party MPs unanimously decided on the report that they have produced, which has been vetoed and ignored. This debate, in fact, the Conservative Party have been responsible in raising this debate, because what is the point of a select committee? What is the point of having scrutiny if Parliament just completely ignore what that committee decides? So, and we're not saying that, we're going to charge forward and lose 3 million jobs. Instead of looking inwards to Europe, we should be looking outwards to countries like China and India. It's not about forsaking jobs. It's about looking for new jobs and looking to the future, to a modern way to grow business and create jobs in the UK.
And John, our statements like the one we've just got there from Nadine and the speech this morning from George Osborne, are they an appeal as much as anything to people who might consider voting UKIP when it comes to Europe? If Europe for them is the central issue, it's not for lots of people, but for those
well, look,
whom it is.
There's no doubt that question preys on the mind of an awful lot of Conservative MPs, and that goes from one end to the other, almost, of the range of opinion within the Tory party over Europe. The UK Independence Party, we all know very well now, has eaten and is eating, and will maybe in the May European elections, eats considerably into Conservative support. For all that Nigel Farage says he gets his support from all over the place, the Tories are the ones feeling most of the pain.
25% is from Labour. We do know that from polling.
Certainly that's so, but I think you could still say disproportionately the pain is being felt by the Conservatives. The pressure is being felt by David Cameron and others, and that had a lot to do with the promise of this referendum in 2017.
But it's also creating an interesting disconnect with some of the Conservatives' traditional allies, perhaps in the City of London, where we see recent survey from the CBI and YouGov suggesting that 8 out of 10 city firms recognise the advantages of our continued membership of the EU. So it definitely is putting David Cameron in a position where to court some of those potential Tory defectors to UKIP, he's having to lose some of the backing of the traditional city businesses that have continued to support the Conservative Party.
We'll leave that there for now. We're going to talk more after the news and sport, but before that, let's get some weather from Simon King.
Hello there, good afternoon. It's a much milder day today compared to yesterday. Temperatures hovering at around about 8 to 12 degrees Celsius as we go through the rest of this afternoon. But with it, we've got lots of clouds, some rather damp and drizzly weather and more persistent rain now spreading its way through towards western parts. Now for Scotland, it will stay pretty wet here throughout the rest of this afternoon. Even though the main band of rain has cleared away in towards Orkney and Shetland, elsewhere across Scotland the cloud is always thick enough to produce the odd spot of rain and drizzle, perhaps even more heavier rain towards the south and the west of the country this afternoon, and temperatures getting to about 9 degrees. For Northern Ireland, some heavy showers moving through here at the moment. They will actually tend to clear away throughout this afternoon, so we might see some late afternoon brightness coming through and turning a little bit drier into this evening, and temperatures staying at about 10 Celsius. For England and Wales, lots of cloud around. If we're lucky, we might see a few brighter skies developing towards the northeast of England, but really for most it will stay cloudy, it'll stay rather damp as well. More persistent rain will spread into northwest England, Wales and the southwest of England throughout this afternoon, moving its way gradually and erratically eastward, and temperatures will hover at about 8 to 12 degrees. Now, through this evening and tonight, this band of showers and rain across western parts will move its way towards the east. Eventually, it will clear away. There'll be some clearer skies, especially across Scotland, where there could be a touch of frost in the north, perhaps even some ice around as well. Temperatures in towns and cities, though, generally speaking, down to about 4 to 8 degrees Celsius. So it will be a colder night compared to last night. But during Thursday, we'll see a rather brisk southwesterly wind, and with it they'll bring in some showers, particularly so for Wales and the south and west of England. Showers moving into eastern parts of Northern Ireland and across Scotland as well. Eastern Scotland and the eastern half of England probably staying a little bit drier during Thursday, and there will be some bright or sunny spells at times. Temperatures getting to around about 7 to 11 degrees.
On digital radio, digital TV, mobile and online.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
With the BBC News on 5 Live, I'm Carissa Chatterton. A man and 2 teenage boys have been found guilty of a series of rapes and sexual assaults in Peterborough. Dano Murger and 2 offenders who can't be named because of their age were convicted of a total of 14 rapes. 2 more men were acquitted. The Prime Minister has told the House of Commons he'll veto any proposal to increase the overall pay and bonus bill at the Royal Bank of Scotland. He was responding to calls from the Labour leader Ed Miliband, who says the government should block RBS from paying out bonuses worth more than 100% of salaries. The jury has been hearing evidence from the first witness in the trial of the Coronation Street star William Roach. He denies 7 sex offences, including 2 counts of rape. More than 40 people have died and scores have been injured after a series of bombings in Iraq. In one attack, a funeral tent was targeted in the town of Buriz, killing at least 16 mourners. And a teenage boy and girl are thought to have flown to the Dominican Republic after going missing from their private boarding school in Lancashire. The 16-year-old students from Stonyhurst College were last seen at Manchester Airport early on Monday morning. Time for the sport now with Mike Williams.
West Ham have made an official complaint to the Premier League this lunchtime over comments from Fulham manager Rennie Moulenstein, who suggested that midfielder Ravel Morrison is keen to move to Craven Cottage. Our sports correspondent Andy Swiss has more.
Last night, Rennie Moulenstein confirmed Fulham had made a bid for Ravel Morrison, which West Ham had rejected, but he thought that Morrison did want to join them. He would bring youthfulness, energy, unpredictability and attacking strength, said Moulenstein. I've made my desires clear, so I'll leave it up to the relevant people to take it forward. The Premier League will now have to decide whether Moulenstein's comments amount to tapping up, an illegal approach to a player without his current club's consent. Whatever their decision, the battle for Morrison's services is becoming increasingly acrimonious.
Elsewhere, Carlton Cole has signed a new 18-month deal at West Ham. The BBC understands that Leighton Baines is close to agreeing a new long-term deal to stay at Everton. Nemanja Matic will have a medical with Chelsea today ahead of a £21 million move back to the club. The Norwegian midfielder Stefan Johansson has joined Celtic on a 3.5-year contract, and FIFA have confirmed that Howard Webb will be the English referee at this summer's World Cup finals in Brazil. After their convincing defeat at Fulham last night in the FA Cup, the Norwich chief executive, David McNally, has told the BBC relegation for his side would be worse than death. Norwich are currently 15th in the Premier League, 2 points off the drop zone, but have gone 7 games without a win. So does McNally believe the pressure is building on manager Chris Hughton?
The brief to Chris was to keep us out of the bottom 3. We're not in the bottom 3, and it's to keep us out of the bottom 3. That's what we have to do. We would not contemplate relegation at our football club. I mean, in a sporting sense, it's worse than death. So don't worry, we are absolutely focused on ensuring that this great football club stays in the Premier League.
In rugby union, the Scotland head coach Scott Johnson has named the uncapped duo of Dougie Fife from Edinburgh and Glasgow flanker Chris Fasaro in his 36-man squad for next month's Six Nations. Stephen Finn is leaving England's tour of Australia early because he's unselectable. That's the verdict of one-day coach Ashley Giles. Finn was the only member of the 17-man test squad not to see any playing action during the Ashes. Kevin Peterson, meanwhile, has been included in the initial 30-man England squad for the World 2020 in Bangladesh in March. Ross Hutchins made a winning return to Grand Slam tennis after recovering from cancer as he and doubles partner Colin Fleming reached the second round of the Australian Open on a day that saw no major shocks at Melbourne Park, the biggest upset coming in the women's draw where the 15th seed Sabine Lisicki was knocked out. Don't forget Andy Murray's second round match in Melbourne is live on 5 Live Sports Extra tomorrow morning. He plays Vincent Millot of France at around 10 a.m. And Neil Robertson is playing Mark Allen in his first round match at the Masters Snooker. Let's get the latest from London's Alexandra Palace with Jamie Broughton.
Well, Neil Robertson is the world number one and last month completed the hat-trick of major domestic titles with his success at the UK Championship in York. Confidence is certainly not in short supply for the popular Australian. As for Mark Allen, he also has the talent and the self-belief required to win this tournament. And the man from Antrim has just taken the opening frame of this match with a century break. 6 is the target for a place in the quarter-finals and a match against Stephen Maguire.
And you can follow all the action from Alexandra Palace on BBC Two and on the BBC Sport website.
Thank you, Mike. Mike has the sports bulletins throughout the afternoon here on 5 Live. Richard is here from 2 and he's here right now.
Sheila,
what do you have, Richard?
Good afternoon, Sheila. Well, a lot. We have the moaning later, the popular moaning Wednesday afternoon. Give us a call. What's been on your mind, winding you up, irritating you? We'll score you out of 10 and potentially declare you the Mona of the week, the Mona Lisa, just before Drive at 4 o'clock. We'll talk about Benefit Street again. It's this show on Channel 4 that gets enormous ratings that has... it is controversial.
It was mentioned in Prime Minister's questions, in fact.
Oh, was it? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear it. In what way was it mentioned, Sheila?
Somebody raised it in one of their questions and then the Prime Minister referred back in his response and said he'd seen a little of it, but not much.
I also heard a caller to Victoria a bit earlier say that, condemn the show, saying that it sets working people against working people. And there are, whichever way you cut it, it has turned out to be a very important programme. Danny Finkelstein of The Times is coming on our programme later. He's written in The Times about it, and he loves the show. He says, I hope the people that made it win awards. And he is of the centre-right. People on the left, in particular, have called it poverty porn. He says the programme raises challenging questions for people on the centre-right because he says that actually when you watch the show, although he doesn't believe in paying people to not do very much, giving them state money to sit around, what he realised watching the show is that actually these people do in some form need a state assistance. And that the end line of his article says, independence doesn't begin automatically when dependence ends. So it's worth exploring that with him. And the school featured in the show, I'll speak to them, a representative of the school. They are calling a public meeting tonight at the school to talk about how they've come across and the many issues that I guess have been brought up by the programme. But it's an important show, Benefit Street. The day after it went out, the exec producer came on the programme as well. So we've kind of been following how this programme has been received for a little while now. So that to come. If you've seen Benefit Street, your thoughts, 85058, bacon at bbc.co.uk. What else? A chap called Trevor Cox is on the show, who's an acoustic engineer, and he's been trying to create the perfect sound. He's written a new book called Sonic Wonderland. He's been on a journey to find the sonic wonders of the world, a tour that's taken him down musical roads, squeaking beaches and creaking glaciers, and he's going to be here to talk about creating and finding the perfect sound, which I think is a nice conversation for an audio-based medium.
Could you ask him to deal with our noisy studio doors while you've got him with you?
Well, you see, that is exactly the sort of background noise that he would hate and find irritating.
Well, he and I have a lot in common.
Yeah, and if you look at the text, all the listeners. What else? Sanjeev Bhaskar, Amira Sayal joined me in the first hour. The Kumars, which ran for 7 series previously, has moved to Sky One. They've changed the show a bit. They're in a new home, but this is about an Asian family. Famous people come around and they interview them.
Okay.
So that to come later. And, the Razzies. The Razzie nominations are about to come out. We'll talk to, this is about terrible films that have been made in the last year. We'll talk about that as well. They come out
the day before the Oscars,
yes.
Oscar announcement, don't they? Thank you, Richard. You're going to have to stop because there'll be nothing left for your programme if you carry on. Okay. Thanks very much, Richard Bacon from 2 here on 5 Live. Now, politicians and affairs. Are private lives fair game for the media? This week, UK papers have shown more interest in French politics, it seems, because of claims the President François Hollande had an affair with an actress. It overshadowed a major speech he gave yesterday about his economic plans, a press conference. Here's what he said about the private stuff.
Everyone in his private life can go through difficult periods. It is our case. These are difficult moments. But I have one principle. Private matters should be dealt with privately in the respect of everybody concerned. So this is not the place. It is not the time to do it.
Well, this also got a mention in Prime Minister's questions today. We'll hear how in just a moment. Nadine Dorries is still here with me, the Conservative MP for Mid-Bedfordshire, Tom Greatrix, Labour MP for Rutherglen and Hamilton West, Stephen Gilbert too, Lib Dem MP for St Austell and Newquay, and John Pienaar, 5 Live's chief political correspondent, is here too. There was something vaguely comical, John, about yesterday's press conference, wasn't there, where there was the President's desperate attempts to talk about the economy, to talk very sincerely about the safety of some French journalists held in Syria, and it seemed the whole world, or whoever was watching, was holding their breath for the question about the love affair.
Well, that was especially the case as far as the British media was concerned, watching this news conference at the Élysée Palace from across the other side of the channel, and waiting for some French journalists to pile in there and ask some absolute rip-roaring personal question that might just throw the President entirely off balance. It didn't happen. The culture of the French media was very different to the British media.
Boy, didn't it happen.
This way.
No, it was phenomenally tame, wasn't it, really, the question?
But the French media's got a reputation for being, I don't know, well, more deferential, put it that way, to their political leaders and political classes than we are in this country. And you can have an argument about where the lines ought to be drawn on both sides, but they do fall pretty deeply onto the deferential side. And the Élysée news conference was arguably some evidence for that.
We know that here in the UK, I'll start with Stephen Gilbert for no particular reason, but we know that in the UK, when it comes to this kind of thing, that gossip, and if somebody is found to be having an affair when they hold a position of power or position of influence, it does tend to bring with it some form of personal destruction as well, doesn't it?
I think that's certainly true, but I think the point that John made about the cultural differences doesn't just extend as far as the media. I think it goes into the public psyche as well. And certainly lots of the vox pops I've seen with French citizens being asked to comment on what they think about the President's alleged affair, they really don't care. They think private matters should remain private. And I think actually that's one of the key differences that then is reflected in the different nations' media. The British public are a lot more interested and a lot more vocal when they think a politician is doing something that they shouldn't be doing.
Well, who reflects who? Because you've just said, Stephen, that you think what happens is that the French media are reflecting the attitudes of the French public. I'm not sure that happens in the UK. I think opinion is whipped up by the media. But, I was thinking to myself on the way over here, we've had impeccable leadership in this country in terms of if you like, public behaviour. We've had private behaviour. If you look at David Cameron, Tony Blair, Margaret Thatcher, Gordon Brown, there's never a sniff of scandal. But I was thinking, just imagine if David Cameron was seen leaving Keira Knightley's hotel bedroom and then a McDonald's all-day breakfast was sent over. What would the British media do with that? What would the British public do? There would be an absolute outcry. There is no way there would be a press conference and a member of the press wouldn't tear him apart for doing that.
You missed, probably for good reason, you missed John Major off the list there.
I was did I? No, not deliberately. But that didn't come out until after.
But it didn't come out until afterwards.
Didn't mean it didn't happen.
Didn't mean it didn't
happen. And what happened? It was the fascination of the nation for about a week.
Well,
so.
I remember interviewing you, John Pienaar, the morning after that revelation that John Major and Edwina Currie had an affair. And you said to me on 5 Live Breakfast that you'd been called early many times with stories, that you had to cover, and only this one had made you maybe fall out of your bed.
Everybody was the same. It's the same reaction everywhere.
It did, but I argued at the time, if you remember, even at the time, that I thought this was in its way, a kind of a gripping story about politicians, but it wasn't a political story. It did not change the course of politics at that time. It hasn't. It hasn't since. It's largely forgotten. I mean, you could, and I think I would argue, that certainly the British media is less rapacious about these stories than it used to be, and the British public are probably less interested than the headline writers might imagine. People tend to say probably a fairly grown-up idea of politicians and sex and all of that kind of stuff. And I mean, how far back do you want to go? There was David Lloyd George had a famously colourful private life, but his eldest son William once said, politicians are like monkeys. The higher they climb, the more likely you are to see their revolting bits. And if you put it in that kind of context, it's maybe more grown up.
I was just thinking about this earlier, and in comparison, what happened in France was that I remember when Robin Cook, when there were the pictures in, I can't remember which newspaper it was, but him furtively going out, putting out his rubbish and feeding the parking meter for the person that he was involved with at the time, who then subsequently became his wife. And I'm not sure you get that in quite the same way now. I think I sort of agree with John's point that really people have, more generally in the UK, have sort of tend to move on a little bit.
Being a bit more generous towards people when those kind of difficulties
happen. And
happen.
also, does it matter? What difference does it make? And if politicians in office are doing things inappropriately or wrong that affect what they're doing in terms of their status and their job as ministers, that's a very different matter from their private lives.
I think what we're seeing is a more socially liberal society in the UK, and I think that the media, the red top assassins particularly, are still trying to print their stories and behave for a public that existed a number of years ago. And I do think the British public are far more relaxed now. It's yet to be tested. We've yet to have a Prime Minister who would have an affair, and it's yet to be tested. But I do think there is this, we're beginning to see the public attitude, I think, march ahead of that of the media in the UK.
I think one thing that will still rile people is where there's hypocrisy and people saying one thing and then doing something
another.
Else. And I think that's probably fair game for journalists to be exposing.
And in France, there's never really that problem, is there? Because there's always this either spoken or unspoken, if it happens approach.
And it's happened just about every president you can think of. Mitterrand, Chirac, it's sort of been almost endemic in the Élysée Palace. Part of the job is
very Gaelic shrug of the shoulders.
Let's not pretend hearts aren't broken in all of this. Politics is one thing, but poor old Valérie still in hospital with a bad case of les bleus.
Yeah,
as they described it.
Extreme les bleus.
Yeah, extreme. Les bleus extrême. Yeah. Not that I'm suggesting you're bleu extrême, Nadine Dorries. Conservative MP for Mid-Bedfordshire, many thanks. Tom Greatrix, Labour MP for Rutherglen and Hamilton West, and Stephen Gilbert, Lib Dem MP for St Austell and Newquay. Great to see you all, many thanks. Thanks, John. Let's get some travel news now from Orna.
Thanks, Sheila. And in Newport, or in South Wales, the M4 was closed on the westbound side from junction 26 at Malpas Road to junction 27 at High Cross. It was to remove an animal from the road. It looks as though the queue is still there, though. It's backing up to junction 25 at Caerleon, but all lanes are open. The M50 on the westbound side, one lane is closed to remove an overturned vehicle. That's around Tewkesbury at junction 1. As I say, just the one lane that's closed from junction 1 to junction 2. And looking at the A roads, the A92 in 5 in Fruquay, both directions are still closed between Fruquay and Ladybank, just near to the Melville Lodges roundabout. Accident investigation work is underway, but there is a diversion signed. Looking at Merseyside, the A41 is closed to remove a broken down lorry near Newchester Road. So it's Newchester Road on the southbound side where it joins up with Old Hall Road. It's just on that side there, but there is a diversion set up. And in West Thurrock in Essex, the A126 on the northbound side, a lorry has overturned and shed its load of metal, and the road is currently partly blocked between the two roundabouts, Lancaster Roundabout and Lakeside Roundabout. Orna Merchant, 5 Live Travel.
5 Live Breakfast
with Nikki Campbell and Rachel Burden.
Private companies have won almost 3/4 of NHS clinical contracts awarded in England since April last year, according to figures from the anti-privatisation pressure group NHS Support Federation. The Department of Health says only around 6% of all work in the NHS is carried out by the private sector.
What it seems to me we have to develop is a proper partnership, as the health service has always been, between public and private sector providers in order to deliver the best possible service to patients.
5 Live Breakfast.
Weekday mornings from 6.
I thanked John and then I dragged him back in because we've had some breaking news on a political story. The Liberal Democrats say the Lib Dem peer Lord Reynard will not now face any further action over allegations of sexual harassment against female political activists because there isn't enough evidence, is the reason given. John, just remind us what he was accused of, Lord Reynard.
Well, there were a number of accusations against Lord Reynard, who used to be a grandee in the Liberal Democrat Party, sort of chief executive, a man with a big say in the selection of candidates, the running of campaigns and all of that sort of thing. And a number of women activists claimed that he behaved in a simply inappropriate way on various occasions towards them. It caused a row, a scandal, and there was an investigation, which we now know has come up with its conclusions, and they are that there is a less than 50% chance that a charge against Lord Bernard could be proved beyond reasonable doubt to the required standard. It's accepted in this investigation that he may have behaved in such a way that violated the personal space, and that's a quote, and the autonomy of the complainants, a jargon way of saying he didn't behave perhaps as he ought to have done, but it fell short on the provable action